Hi, I'm Kristen Goodwin. On this episode of the Fox News Rundown, Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton was warning Americans to take the coronavirus seriously in January. The Republican lawmaker joins host Jessica Rosenthal to discuss what Congress must do to address COVID-19, the nation's economic crisis, and bringing pharmaceutical manufacturing back to America. Also, health officials are issuing warnings about reopening economies too quickly. Monica Crowley, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Public Affairs, joins host Dave Anthony to discuss the plan to help Americans struggling financially amid the pandemic. Plus, commentary from Fox News contributor and radio host Leslie Marshall. The Fox News Rundown is a daily news podcast where we take a deeper look at the stories important to you. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast player by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
I'm Tammy Bruce.
I'm Juan Williams.
I'm Shannon Bream, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Wednesday, May 13th, 2020. I'm Jessica Rosenthal. The short-term fight against the virus involves money, masks, and testing, but the long-term fight might involve some moving.
We can never allow China to continue to have such a stranglehold on so many critical supplies to keep our people safe, healthy, and prosperous.
I'm Dave Anthony. House Democrats are pushing $3 trillion in new economic stimulus. And the money approved earlier? Well, it's been going out to more smaller businesses lately.
That was the intention of the program, to make sure that the mom and pop shops that make America so great and are the beating heart of this economy were taken care of and have the resources that they need.
And I'm Leslie Marshall. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
One of the big metrics in the fight against the virus has been testing for it. Not just for the heck of it, but to self-quarantine or isolate if one is positive. Some of the countries that seem to have fared better than others with COVID-19 got on testing fast, early, and they were able to test many people. We in the U.S. had some delays in testing. We know this, and we know that it set us back. But since the earlier days of the pandemic, we've ramped up testing, and private companies and labs created their own tests. Now the U.S. is leading in testing, according to White House spokeswoman Kayleigh McEnany.
The U.S. now leads the world in testing. For weeks, the media cited South Korea as being the gold standard for testing. But as it stands, we are now testing at a higher rate per capita than South Korea. And in fact, as this chart is going to show you, in all 50 states, we are now testing at a higher rate per capita than South Korea.
Testing is still a key focus elsewhere. Reuters reported this week that after a small handful of cases were detected in Wuhan, China, officials there said they'd be testing all 11 million residents. Wuhan is, of course, where evidence shows the virus outbreak began. And despite apparent efforts from China to downplay the virus, they couldn't hide the entirety of their reaction. And that is what caught the attention of one senator now leading the charge against China.
I could tell early on in January that China's rhetoric, that they were in control and the virus was not a threat and there's no cause for alarm, contrasted with their draconian, extreme measures to counteract the virus.
Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton.
It's like canceling schools nationwide or literally welding the doors shut on apartment buildings. So that's what set off the alarms to me early on. But for as long as I've been in public life, I've recognized China as a grave threat to the United States, with an ultimate ambition to replace us as the world's preeminent economic and military power. So some of the measures I propose, like trying to keep Huawei, the Chinese telecom giant that is effectively an arm of Chinese intelligence, out of Western telecom systems, are longstanding. Now, I've introduced new measures related to this virus, for instance, trying to bring back pharmaceutical manufacturing to the United States, and other measures that are designed more broadly to check Chinese emissions in the Western Pacific and around the world. And that's because China is the most serious long-term threat the country faces to our security and prosperity.
When we talk about bringing pharmaceutical manufacturing back, how delicate a process is that? And do we run the risk of China saying, oh, you're going to go ahead and do that? Well, we're just going to stop making the medications you need right now.
So China is already threatening those kinds of actions against many nations, threatening to withhold either drugs or needed protective equipment from nations if, for instance, they don't agree to use Huawei in their fifth-generation wireless build-out. Or just refusing to send protective equipment to a country unless the head of state goes and meets the Chinese airplane and kowtows on the tarmac for the cameras. So we have to be mindful that in the short term, the world is somewhat dependent, not entirely, but somewhat dependent on China for both drugs and medical equipment. But that's why in the medium and especially the long term, we can never allow China to continue to have such a stranglehold on so many critical supplies to keep our people safe, healthy, and prosperous.
Where are you, though, on our own mistakes? It seems like we did make quite a few here, China or not, whether that was, not maybe having enough equipment on our own stockpile, to our own testing delays and failures, including, unbelievably, our own tests, some of which were tainted with the actual virus.
Yeah, so first off, I would commend the president for taking an action that was considered very controversial at the time of stopping air travel from China in late January. I'd advocated for that since the middle of January when I first started contrasting Chinese rhetoric to action. That bought us several weeks of needed time. And it did the same thing with Europe as well. Again, it wasn't foolproof. It wasn't ever going to stop the virus from reaching the United States, but it certainly bought time. You're right that probably the worst mistake the federal bureaucracy has made is when the Centers for Disease Control insisted on doing its own tests, manufacturing its own tests from scratch, rather than, if you will, letting 1,000 flowers bloom in some of our great laboratories and companies all around the world. The FDA as well, allowed the CDC to do that, and then was slow on certifying other possible tests in early February. So that's regrettable. In the end, though, the challenge that we have had is not so much a science challenge about developing the right kind of tests. It's really a production challenge of being able to develop testing equipment for a nation of 330 million people, as opposed to, say, Austria with a nation of 8 million people, or Taiwan, an island nation of 22 million people. But over time, we have begun to meet that challenge. That's why now, on a per capita basis, we have one of the best records in the country for testing. But it would have been better early on, of course.
Of course. I mean, look at how many people have died. Look at how many people have died since then. I mean, do you think testing could have made a big difference?
So I think the lessons that we've seen from countries around the world is that testing can help slow the spread of the virus and therefore help protect the capacity of our hospital systems, which again is the reason why we instituted such severe measures in March related to social distancing. But in the end, the virus is so highly contagious in so many different settings, testing can only do so much. It's better to have more testing than less testing. Especially testing at sites that are most vulnerable, like nursing home sites or critical infrastructure that can only engage in a limited amount of social distancing given the necessities of work, like meatpacking plants. So testing is very important in those places. But in the end, even the nations that have had the best approach to testing, especially in Europe, you still see pretty significant numbers of cases and deaths on a per capita basis. And sadly, that's just a reflection of the very highly contagious and very deadly nature of the virus for some populations.
States are starting to reopen, as you know, some allowing more than others. This is apparently changing the models, I guess, yet again. University of Washington's Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation is now estimating that about 137,000 people could die from COVID. And I think a lot of us don't really know what to say anymore about these models changing, right? Like if you're for reopening because you care about livelihoods and jobs, then you're accused of being okay with letting people die. And then you hear, far more people may die because we're increasing mobility. And it's just, it's like everybody's between a rock and a hard place. Like, what do we do here?
Well, I've never been a big fan of any of the models. Not to say that models can't be useful for decision making, but they're always based to a degree on speculation as opposed to hard information. So I prefer to look at the hard data. We have a lot of data now that we didn't have 2 months ago, not just from the United States and places like New York that were particularly hard hit, but also from Europe. And you see countries that were hit with the virus a few weeks before we were. They're now been a few weeks ahead of us in terms of getting their economy back on its feet. And so far, seems to be working for them in places like Austria and Denmark and Germany as well. So I think we should learn as much as we can from those international models and also examples, not models, I should say. And then also, kind of gradually move forward with getting our economy back on its feet, getting people back to work, getting them back in their normal routines. Obviously, if there's a big surge in cases somewhere, that might cause us to recalibrate or pull back on the reins a little bit. But it's vitally important that we get people back to work, back into their normal routines, because the government cannot replace the economy. And without a healthy, strong, functioning economy, people are at risk not just of their livelihoods, but also their health as well. They're foregoing basic treatments like mammograms or colon screenings.
Yeah.
They are, in many cases, suffering from mental health challenges or stress related to family and the workplace and so forth. So the health and the economic questions are more interconnected than much of the media commentary would suggest. And we have to keep both those things in mind.
Senator, when we talk about reopening and we look at a model country like South Korea, they're experiencing an increase in cases. And we kind of thought they had mastered this, right? But now they're starting to see some more. With contract tracing, now they're trying to notify over 1,500 people after one infected person visited a number of bars and nightclubs in one evening. I think this speaks, one, to the importance of contract tracing, I guess, and knowing who's infected, and two, how one person can do just so much damage and upend the work that you do when you try and isolate for a while.
Yeah, and obviously South Korea has been one of the leading examples in the world, along with Taiwan, for keeping the virus under control. So I'm troubled by the resurgence in cases there over the last couple of days. I certainly hope that they get it under control again. You see the same thing happen in Singapore in April. They had been a world leader as well in March, and then they had a large flare up in April that I think is continuing. It's just a reminder that no matter how much testing there is, how much contact tracing, the virus is so contagious, and there's still so much we don't know about it.
Finally, Senator, on stimulus, there's still a lot of talk that even more is needed as we work slowly towards getting back to normal. I know some Democrats want to give a lot more money to people. Congress has already allocated almost $3 trillion. The president's talking about a payroll tax cut. Our governor in California says 4.5 million people are unemployed, and we had a budget surplus that is now a massive deficit. Where are you on stimulus and how much more we're going to give, and whether or not we could give any to states and counties?
Well, so the Congress has already approved about $3 trillion of spending to help survive the peak of this crisis. A lot of that money, though, hasn't gone out the door. It hasn't hit the pockets of individual workers in the case of enhanced unemployment benefits, which are approved at the end of July, or money to aid state and local governments or to help our hospital systems. So I think for the time being, there's enough money still in the pipeline for us to see how that works, and that hopefully, within a matter of weeks, not months, we will begin to see people getting back to something more like their normal work and consumption routines, and that it won't be necessary to have trillions of dollars of more spending to replace the productive economic activities of our citizens. In the end, I think most people don't want a relief check, they want a paycheck. And that's where I hope we can get very soon, a matter of weeks, not in a matter of months.
Senator Cotton, thank you so much for your time.
Yep, thank you.
This is Leslie Marshall with your Fox News commentary coming up.
Doctors on the White House coronavirus task force made a house call to the Senate.
Rapid, extensive, and widely available timely testing is essential for reopening America.
Those CDC Director Dr. Robert Redfield, FDA Commissioner Dr. Steve Hahn, and Dr. Anthony Fauci weren't actually there. They appeared via video, each in quarantine for having contact with someone who has the coronavirus.
There is no doubt, even under the best of circumstances, when you pull back on mitigation, you will see some cases appear.
But Dr. Fauci warned if states do too much, too fast,
you will trigger an outbreak that you may not be able to control, which in fact, paradoxically, will set you back, not only leading to some suffering and death that could be avoided, but could even set you back on the road to trying to get economic recovery.
And while Democrats thanked the doctor for his guidance, they took shots at the president. Senator Patty Murray calling the White House response disastrous.
The fact of the matter is President Trump has been more focused on fighting against the truth than fighting this virus. And Americans have sadly paid the price.
Republican Senator Lamar Alexander, who chaired Tuesday's hearing by video, also in quarantine after his staffer got the virus, said reopen we must.
Staying at home indefinitely is not the solution to this pandemic. There's not enough money available to help all those hurt by a closed economy.
Already, the federal government has spent a record amount to help Americans. 30 million have filed for unemployment in just the past 6 weeks.
Obviously, we're in an unprecedented situation. We have never faced anything like this before, where the government has actually mandated a nationwide economic shutdown.
Monica Crowley is Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Public Affairs.
There was an understanding very early on that because the government was shutting it down, the government was going to also have to provide the solution, and the government was going to have to step in and fill that void. So we had a series of pieces of legislation come through, be signed into law by the president that, yes, are very expensive, require a lot of money, trillions and trillions of dollars.
Where does this money come from? Treasury bonds, is that essentially what it is that the U.S. is selling treasuries, and that's what's funding all this?
That is certainly part of it. Yes, the Federal Reserve has stepped in, and they are providing trillions of dollars in liquidity. I think it's about $4 to $5 trillion in liquidity as well through special vehicles, special facilities, as we call them, that have been stood up to transfer a lot of these funds to where they need to go under the legislation.
All right, now let's go through some of the things that have happened, including the checks that went out, $1,200 for an individual, $2,400 for a married couple. For most Americans, have the majority of people gotten these payments?
Yes, the economic impact payments were stood up within the space of about 2 weeks, and we were able to, as of today, we were able to get out about 130 million payments, $1,200 each, more if you have dependent children. And we were able to do it because we have mechanized a lot of this via direct deposit. So if you filed your tax returns and have your direct deposit information on file with the IRS, so every year you can get your refunds, I hope, that information having been there, those payments were able to go into your bank account immediately. We are now in the phase of paper checks for those who did not have the direct deposit information on file. And by the way, I just want to point out that this is the last opportunity. You can go to irs.gov, click on Get My Payment to input your direct deposit information and get your checks right away. If you don't do that by Wednesday of this week, then you will get your money, but it will come in the form of a paper check. If you haven't gotten it already, you will get it.
Obviously, there's a lot of work to get the Paycheck Protection Program money out as well. There's a lot of money to try to help businesses. There's where are we on the second version of this? I know that it was replenished, the fund. How much of that fund is still left?
Of the PPP fund. Okay, right. So there were two tranches of money. The first tranche was $350 billion. Second tranche was about $310 billion. And we have, since April 27th, when the second tranche began flowing out again, when we relaunched the program after getting the money appropriated by Congress, we have appropriated about $188 billion of that $310. So there is still plenty of money left for small businesses to protect their workers and keep them on the payroll and to cover acceptable overhead like mortgage, rent, utilities, and so on. In order for the loan to be forgivable, though, keep in mind 75% of the money needs to go to payroll, cover the workers. It's called the Paycheck Protection Program. So we want small businesses to protect their workers and have this money to bridge them over this period of time, 8 weeks. And then the additional 25% is, like I said, for that acceptable overhead. And then if you meet those and bring the documentation to your lender who gave you the loan to begin with, that loan will be forgiven. So it's more of a grant than a loan.
All right. Now, there are also some confusion I've been reading in different stories for some companies wondering if they are eligible.
So you have to make a certification. When you go to an approved lender, you have to make a certification that you are indeed a small business. You have to show documentation about your payroll and how many employees you have, so that you have to prove that you're eligible to participate in this loan program.
Fewer than 500 workers, right? Is that correct? Fewer than 500 employees?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
And what we're seeing now, too, Dave, is that in the first tranche of money, the average loan going out was about $120,000 to $150,000, I believe. Now the average loan size is about $72,000, $73,000. So those loan sizes are coming down, meaning that these small business loans are actually going to the smallest of small businesses, businesses with 5 employees or less. And really, that was the intention of the program, to make sure that the mom and pop shops that make America so great and are the beating heart of this economy were taken care of and have the resources that they need. So this program has been a big success. And what we have seen, though, early on was that there were some larger companies that had additional sources of liquidity, bigger companies or public companies that had plenty of money, frankly, or other sources of liquidity that were trying to get in on this. And Secretary Mnuchin made it very clear that, no, if you have these additional sources of liquidity, you should not be in the PPP process. You should not be trying to get these loans. So you saw a number of businesses. Ruth's Chris Steakhouse was a famous one, Potbelly. There were some others. I don't mean to single them out because there were plenty who realized that they were not supposed to be part of this program and returned the money. And so we had billions of dollars then come back into the pot that's now being distributed to small businesses that have gone through this process of applying and certifying their eligibility.
More companies are considering giving up the loans, and there are reports of confusion about the rules they claim have been changed along the way by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. For instance, what about businesses that have fewer than 500 employees but are publicly traded? Some of those companies believe that makes them ineligible and have paid it back. Others do not and plan to keep it. So we asked Monica Crowley to clarify.
We say that it is unlikely that a public company with substantial market value and access to capital could make the required certification in good faith. And if they do, they should be prepared to demonstrate to the SBA the basis for the certification. But we don't say unequivocally that they can't do PPP. It depends on the circumstances.
So I understand that companies that may decide to give back the money and not keep the loans are on deadline and have to give it back by tomorrow. And if they do, they won't face any penalties.
That is correct. So the safe harbor was extended through this Thursday. And if you have the money and hold on to it and do not pay it back, you could be open to investigation and possible criminal liability.
Tuesday afternoon, House Democrats unveiled their plan to hand out $3 trillion in more economic stimulus, planning a vote on it Friday. Now, Senate Republicans have said they'd like to wait till maybe June to let the earlier packages keep working. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says
the hunger doesn't take a pause. The rent doesn't take a pause. The hardship doesn't take a pause.
And she says not acting is the most expensive course. Democrats call their bill the HEROES Act and want to provide state and local governments $1 trillion. They propose another round of checks for Americans, $1,200 per family member, up to 5, $200 billion in hazard pay to essential workers, and extending $600 a week extra unemployment checks till January. But all that may not go anywhere in the Senate as talks with President Trump continue.
I want to see a payroll tax cut. I want to see various things that we want. I want the workers to be taken care of. But we are talking about that. We're negotiating with the Democrats. We'll see what happens.
Now, a payroll tax cut could help both workers and their employers since they both pay that tax. It's unclear how big any reduction would be or how long it might last. There was one that started in 2011 after the recession then that gave workers 2% of their income back for 2 years.
So the president has been very interested in a payroll tax holiday, and he believes that it will further stimulate the economy. The president, the vice president, Secretary Mnuchin have all talked about a strong rebound in the third quarter and really a very powerful continuing rebound into the fourth quarter and into next year. And the president believes that a payroll tax holiday will further add juice to the economic engine once we emerge fully from this crisis. I think that what you've seen on the Hill is some pushback, particularly from Republicans on that, but also Democrats are not all that interested in it. So from a legislative standpoint, we'll have to see where it goes. But the president has talked a lot about that. And I do know that he's got advisors around him who also believe in the power of that to help American workers.
Monica Crowley, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Public Affairs, thank you so much for joining us.
It is my great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Dave.
It's the latest from Fox News Podcasts, The Campaign with Bret Baier, with updates from reporters on the trail and in-studio experts. Bret keeps you informed on the 2020 race. Go to foxnewspodcast.com and download The Campaign with Bret Baier now. Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Leslie Marshall.
What's on your mind?
Former Vice President and now presumptive Democratic 2020 presidential nominee Joe Biden has been accused by Tara Reade, a former staff assistant who worked in the then senator's office 27 years ago, of sexual assault. He's done an interview with MSNBC's Mika Brzezinski, and in that interview, the former vice president said he is innocent. I quote, "No, it never happened," unequivocally. After an additional interview that Ms. Reade did with Megyn Kelly online, the vice president doubled down, "No, it never happened," unequivocally. I believe Joe Biden, and here's why. I am a woman, a feminist, and the mother of a preteen girl who knows that there are differences between rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. And sadly, I have been the victim of all three. I, like the former vice president, believe that when a woman comes forward with claims of sexual misconduct against anyone, you believe her, but then you investigate. You go through a vetting process to find the truth. First, we must look at a few things aside from my opinion. In 2016, President Trump, who himself has a long list of accusations against him, brought in some of former President Clinton's accusers to sit in on a debate when he was running against Hillary Clinton, the wife of the former president. Why didn't Donald Trump attack Joe Biden with this information the way he did with Hillary Clinton's husband's accusers' claims and attacking her with that? When Blasey Ford made the claims against Brett Kavanaugh, Donald Trump mocked her publicly. And why have all of the media been timid about this? Well, I think I know why. And I think it's because Ms. Reade is not a credible witness. First, there are huge inconsistencies. A year ago, she told a reporter that when she was a staff assistant in 1993, she said that Joe Biden touched her shoulder and neck in a way that made her feel uncomfortable. But then that story changed to Joe Biden sticking his hand under her skirt and forcibly penetrating her with his fingers. It takes a lot to come forward. So why would she then change her accusation a year later? Her claims that she made a complaint to the Senate Personnel Office, well, no one's been able to find that complaint. No one's been able to corroborate that. Perhaps for me, the two biggest reasons I question the authenticity of this specific accusation are Reade cannot remember the date, time, or exact location of the incident. She's only said that she was delivering a gym bag to former Vice President Biden somewhere in the Capitol. That's according to what she told the Washington Post. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this piece, I've been the victim of rape, assault, and harassment. Now, I can understand someone not remembering the date or the day of the week or perhaps the exact time, but the location? I am sorry. I and most victims I know I've spoken with remember the location vividly as that terrible nightmare replays in our minds over and over and over throughout the years. And also, something very unsettling for me was Ms. Reade's praise of her alleged assaulter. She publicly praised Joe Biden for his work on the Violence Against Women Act. She did this not just once, but on multiple occasions. As a victim, I would never praise my attackers. What I'd like to do to them is something straight out of a scene from The Sopranos, but certainly not praise. Former Vice President has requested that the National Archives release any record they have of Reid's claims. Put it out, he said, although they won't. And I agree. If the truth is truly what we're after, put it out there. Please put it out. I'm Leslie Marshall.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust, and click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.